let's start off with the basic foundation of this report. What is at the very core of what you've written here?
Okay, first and foremost, I'm a lawyer by trade, so brevity is the bane of my existence. We're quite prolix in our language. So the way I try to approach it is from that perspective, is to what gauged my interest is that there's a report of, there's an index that was established by the Institute of Race Relations that keeps a list of all the racial laws in the Republic. What shocked me was that about 37% of those laws were promulgated under a constitution that guarantees equality and effectively prohibits racial discrimination. So how do we marry the fact that there's a prohibition on racial discrimination with such an abundance of racial laws? So that was what I tried to figure out in the report. And by looking at those laws and looking at the provisions of the Constitution and the relevant legislation, I tried grouping the laws into certain groups to keep the discussion digestible. So the first group are the laws that are sorry, I have to go back just one step to what do we consider to be racial legislation. So the definition that I place to it is a legislative act that contains race in some form or another. So anything that has a racial connotation will then be racial legislation. Then the question comes up, is a law, because it incorporates race, per se wrong? And of course not. So that's the first grouping of laws. Laws that incorporate race but aims to address racism. That's, for example, PEPUDA, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, that says you're not allowed to discriminate. There are certain other pieces of legislation that also prohibits racism. Rental Housing Act that prohibits racial discrimination in leases. There's provisions in the Schools Act that say you're not allowed to deny a child school placement because of race, etc., etc. Competition Act that says dominant firms may not use race as a criteria for doing business with them. So those are uncontroversial. I think we all can agree that those kinds of legislation is acceptable. We don't want racism. Then we have the second grouping, and that's the majority of our racial laws. Not all of our racial laws are expressly racial in character, but they have racial components to them. And they can broadly be grouped together under the principle of representativity. So the report lists, I think, 57 acts and sections in different acts of boring nature. Geographical associations, engineering councils, auditor councils, all of these statutory regulatory bodies all have a provision that says that when we look at the composition of a board of a statutory body, that board's racial composition has to reflect the demographics of the Republic as a whole. So that means majority black population, minority Indian, colored, and whites. So it establishes a racial hierarchy in hiring practices to say that despite the merit of the candidate, you have to appoint basis on the majority or minority population groups in the Republic. So that's the second group. And then the third group, we have the expressly racial laws. Those are your Employment Equity Act, Preferential Procurement Policy, your broad-based black economic empowerment that have express provisions of a racial nature. So what I then tried to do is establish a framework under which we can assess these laws. And the approach that I decided upon is, if you read the Constitution as well as PEPUDA, it says that no law may permit the racial discrimination on the basis of race unless those laws aim to alleviate the adverse consequences of past racial discrimination. So me being a lawyer, I saw an onus. There's to some certain extent that the government must show that the racial legislation promulgated actually goes to some extent to alleviate the past racial discrimination. And I decided that's going to be my approach to the debate, is to say, start asking the question as to whether or not these policies or these acts of parliament actually alleviate. And I think if you don't have to do much of an empirical study to just look back and see, all right, we're quite far into our democratic regime, 1994, Constitution 1996. So we're looking at about 20 to 30 years of diminishing of racial legislation that was promulgated under the nationalist government. But the ills that we say need to be addressed are still there. Employment is increasing, infrastructure is decreasing.
Unemployment
unemployment is increasing, our economy is stagnating. So if we work under the assumption that these laws are supposed to improve those measurements, I think we can pretty safely assume that it's doubtful as to whether or not these legislative enactments actually achieve those results. And if it doesn't do that, then it's nothing more than just a racial discriminatory policy. So I think the conclusion of the report is basically to say that we need to start thinking and challenging the powers that be to start showing evidence for the benefit, or the evidence that it is actually achieving what it's supposed to do, because absent that improvement, it's nothing more than just a racially discriminatory policy, and it's unconstitutional. It can't stand in that regard.
And if they can't provide that evidence of these goals being reached through these discriminatory policies, then there needs a serious rethinking of the existence of these types.
Exactly, and South Africa is not unique. I mean, there's a lot of countries that implements affirmative action in one form or of another. There's a book by Thomas Sowell, an American jurist. He did the empirical studies. He went to India, United States, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Nigeria. And across the board, the conclusion is that racially discriminatory policies or affirmative action policies, they don't work. They usually come to benefit just a small group of that benefited group. And they get a lot of benefit of it. And I think that's also a lot of impetus for the persistence of the laws. Those who make the decisions are those who benefit from these policies. And they, at the end of the day, won't get rid of it because, of course, they benefit, despite the fact that it doesn't actually assist those who it is supposed to assist. And also it has the adverse consequence for those being discriminated against as well.
I think there you cut to the very core of the issue, is that these discriminatory pieces of legislation have created a small elite that are now, whose wealth is completely dependent on the existence of these types of laws, or the continuation of these types of laws, and therefore they have a vested interest in continuing them, and they are very powerful and influential, so they are fighting very hard for their own seat at the table, but nobody else. It's an exclusive club, and the average person on the street is not in it. Johan, when you look at you've done your research now on specifically the extent of racial discriminatory laws in South Africa. When we look at the bigger picture and use a label like, if the South African government is not the most race-obsessed government in the world, it's probably one of the most race-obsessed governments in the world. Do you think that's a label that's warranted?
I believe so. Look, as I said, South Africa is not unique in the fact that it has these affirmative action policies. There are a lot of countries that implement them. But I think there are some quirky elements to our situation that makes it a bit, that makes the statement more true. South Africa is one of the few societies where affirmative action measures are aimed to promote the majority, not the minority. Usually inclusionary policies are to bring up marginalized groups, to bring them into the fold. Our policies are a bit reversed in the extent that it is to exclude a specific group from the economy by giving a preference to a majority group. That's one thing. I think also where in the world we might be seeing a bit more scaling back of affirmative action, we are aggressively going forward. Ours are becoming intensifying. I'm thinking just, for example, in the United States, although that is also a controversial country, but I mean the Harvard University policy that was overturned, that they're no longer allowed to look at race at university admissions. It has its own political baggage, that statement, but in the Western world, we're seeing a pulling back, but in our situation, we are seeing an acceleration. And I think the statement is fair.
And you have touched on it, but if there's anything else you'd like to add in regards to, while you were doing this research, some of the shocking things that you discovered, or some shocking pieces of legislation that stood out to you that made a particular impression on you?
The third category those are the problematic matters, especially given if you can't trace the benefit towards the extent. I mean, If you think about the proposed amendments to the Employment Equity Act, that is basically numerical targets, nothing more than quotas to say, if you're doing, the shocking one is, for example, in Limpopo, if you're in the forestry industry in Limpopo, you're not allowed to have any colored people working for you. There's a zero quota to say they're not allowed to work in Limpopo. So it's becoming very aggressive and penal, the nature. And also where the legislation that I compared to in other countries, they encourage it. There is penalties to the extent that if you racially discriminate against somebody, you'll be penalized for it. South Africa, we're going into a regime whereby you're punished if you don't racially discriminate. There's a fine of 10% your annual turnover, or a minimum of 2.5 million.
That was what Diskim cited.
That was Diskim's entire rationale, to say that we have to discriminate against our employees because if we don't, we face consequences ourselves. I think it's a very pernicious element to the South African regime that I could not find in other regimes, really, to say we encourage diversity, but if you don't diversify, we're going to hit you with a stick. And we have a pretty big stick.
Yeah, and maybe just a piece of context if there are any international listeners. In regards to Limpopo, and you talked about colored applicants there not being able to get a job in the lumber industry there, that's specifically representativity at work, because in the context of South Africa, Limpopo is probably one of the provinces with the least representation demographically of the colored population, which is a specific ethnic group in South Africa. And I mean, that just shows the insanity of that approach. So if you are a colored South African that finds himself in Limpopo and within the lumber industry and you want to get a job there, you're just going to be shown away. Specifically now, touching on the international community and what they need to know about South Africa, what would you say if an international journalist, researcher, anyone, even just a normal person that's interested in what's happening in South Africa, what do you think is important for them to know about race laws in South Africa? What's some critical details about it?
I think what needs to be understood by hopefully the international community is that it is the phase that we are entering into. I think what the ANC government is doing is contrary to what has been published about South Africa to a large extent. I mean, since the ANC's founding, I think in 1943, their conference documents has been quite clear. The establishment of non-racial South Africa, where race would not play a role in society. History unfolded, we got to a point where that principle has been enshrined in our constitutional order. We say we're a non-racial society. It's one of the founding provisions of our constitution. And despite that trend, we are pivoting away from that at quite a significant rate. And I think the liberation movement garnered a lot of its credibility on that. This is the society. This is a very good society we want to establish, but it's moving away from that. And I think that's tragic. I mean, a non-racial society is a society that we would like to live in, but we're pivoting quite significantly away from it. And these legislative provisions show it. It's becoming entrenched that is not the view that we are espousing anymore. And barring that, we need to figure out what's the society we're building, a racial one or a non-racial one. Yeah. It's polar opposites.
And it creates a lot of moral dilemmas as well. For example, if a white parent wants to teach their child that racial discrimination is wrong, but everywhere they look around them, they see racial discrimination against them. There's no way to bring those two poles together. There's no way to make sense of that situation. Either, that's why I mentioned earlier, it's either wrong in principle or it's not. There needs to be a principled stance that racial discrimination is wrong.
You could take it further. I mean, let's say, for example, that child who has been learned not to racially discriminate, now is sitting on a board of directors of a company and he has to implement an employment equity plan. So he's been taught, don't racially discriminate, but now he fears the closure of the business because he has to now to decide whether or not to employ. Who of what race? Do we have enough of those? It's like counting Beanie Babies. You have to then see how many employees you have and you have to split them up. I mean, you have to choose which path are you going to follow, and we're on the wrong path. I believe.
That's a critical point. Johan, I'd like to, if you are ready for questions if there's any questions from the people that have attended here. If there's not, we will conclude it here, but I'll open the floor now if there's any questions. Yes.
So, in the new regulations that are going to come out for the employment equity amendments, Solidarity struck a deal. One of the deal lines is that affirmative action is recognized as a temporary measure. Now, in that Harvard case that you mentioned, there was a time limit for race-based measures in education from a case called Rudder, where they sort of foresaw a 25-year horizon. And Clarence Thomas looks at this and says, well, if we look at the last 20 years, we're not seeing any improvement in terms of deviating from race, and the time is up now. It strikes me as just a very powerful tactical tool to end that. As I say, for the temporary measure, there must be a time at which it comes to an end. If you look at our case law, you see this from the Constitutional Court as well, saying you mustn't throw out the baby of non-racialism with race-based redress, and it must come to an end. And so that seems like an important part to take, to try and tie it to a period. The other thing that you have is that maybe there was a point in time when race was a good proxy for disadvantage. But as time marches on, it becomes less and less of a good proxy. And really what you have is a creamy layer that benefits, and most Africans who don't. The Institute for Racial Relations has polled people and said, do you know anyone who's benefited from race-based action? Only 20% of people say yes. Have you? Only 10% of people say yes. So there's a sense in which one way to create a time bar is in your definition of the designated groups, is to say if you're born before a certain period, then you can benefit from it, and after that, not. And then it would sort of necessarily create a time bar. There might be other methods for it. The other thing that you alluded to was this idea that it violates your deeply held beliefs to have to implement a race-based policy. And of course, we have a constitutional right to freedom of belief and conscience. And so you might think that when you require private businesses to enforce this policy, that you're violating the constitutional rights. And that strikes me as a unique angle.
No, of course. And the sunset clause, there's a lot of literature that I didn't include it, is that there's vehement opposition to a sunset clause based on, I think, the predominant idea. I can't prove it, but as we say, that we suspect that those who benefit from it are the same people that make the decisions about implementing the policy, and they're not going to relinquish that benefit that they receive. But I think that the most effective way that civil society can fight it is to a certain extent to say, start challenging the government, perhaps in court papers, to say, show us the evidence, show us that it's working. Because I think that's the angle that succeeded in the Harvard case. I think if we implement it here, to say, take one policy and say, how many people did this benefit? Show us your numbers. If you can't, then it's unlawful. You can't do it any other way.
Are there any other questions there? Yes.
Thank you. Just to add to what you just said, to say that there must be a sunset clause and that there should be an end to let's call it affirmative action. It's just part of the story. Sorry, it's just part of the story. It goes, to me, it goes much wider than that, much further than that. And that is not only is there no sunset clause really, or sunset planning for this, not only has it been opposed by the people benefiting from the current situation, but they have actually, and I want to say actively, undermined and worked against creating the conditions in which you can say that now we have equality in our economy, in our country, by for example, failing in the education system and not educating people to be able to get proper jobs, and secondly, not stimulating the economy, actually undermining the economy of South Africa. So that in itself is a borders on a crime that they committed in South Africa. which means that, you know, having an end to this madness is not foreseeable at this stage.
I also believe it ties into what Mark said, is that I think in 1994 it was quite safe to say that the disadvantage felt by any group at that stage was by virtue of race, because it was directly the basis upon which the disadvantage was imposed upon them. But 20 years later, we're looking at much more intervening factors that persists. It might be that prior racial laws were the origins of the disadvantage, but the disadvantage is perpetuated by current situations. The fact that South Africa's logistic infrastructure is gone, its economy is struggling, it's all the while. I heard listened to a report by a Deloitte analyst. He says that for the last 20 years, China's consumption boom, South Africa benefit from high commodity prices and the exports, where other countries, Thailand, Australia, reinvested those funds into infrastructure, logistic infrastructure, power generation. We received the same benefit in South Africa, but our infrastructure went back. We went backwards on Transnet. So I think where the accelerated racial discriminatory practices, I believe, is becoming a proxy or an excuse for diverting attention away from those instances where we're saying, well, if somebody asks the government the question, okay, but where's the benefit we are receiving? It's easier to pivot to say that the market economy, it's still a white-dominated economy, etc. That's an easier answer than to say that we have to take ownership of our failings and the fact that we have allowed state capture to reign supreme for a number of years that pilfered our government institutions. So I think it's becoming an excuse, and they have to double down on that principle, other than admitting to say, well, okay, we had a bit of an issue in how we governed and managed the funds up to now.
Yes, well, thank you very much, everyone, again for attending. The report, Racialized Legislation in South Africa, is here available in hard copy for all of you, and then also if you are watching this video, there will be a link in the description to go read this report for yourself, and you can also find it on AfriForum's website under reports. Thank you everyone for tuning in and also for attending in person. Thank you for your questions and your comments, and there will now also be opportunity for further discussion afterwards. And thank you to all AfriForum's members for making this type of research possible and this type of exposure of the racialized legislation of the South African government possible. Thank you for becoming a member and making the creation of these types of sources a reality. And if you're not a member of AfriForum yet, you can easily become one to support these types of initiatives by going to the website and clicking join. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you again real soon. Tot ziens.